All right, good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you're calling in from. My name is Andy Blanco. I'm with Riverside Insights, and I want to thank you for taking the time to join us today for this webinar on social emotional learning in gifted. Before we get started, just a few quick announcements, some housekeeping. During the presentation, if you have any questions, please enter them in the questions panel, and we'll address them as we can, either in the context of the conversation or at the end. A recording of today's presentation and a certificate of attendance will be sent to all registrants by the end of this week. The recordings from our previous webinars can also be found on our website at info.riversideinsights.com/K12PD. Don't worry about remembering that. It'll be in the email and in the recording as well, along with any other links that we talk about in today's conversation. So with that, it is my pleasure to introduce our esteemed panelists today. We have Adam Lanningham, author of Gifted Children and How Trauma Impacts Them, and some other books. He is Arizona Gifted Teacher of the Year for 2014 and President-elect of Supporting the Emotional Needs of the Gifted. We also have Christina Jordan, National Academic Advisor for Riverside Insights, also an assessment program specialist, author, ed tech subject matter expert, and former elementary school teacher. So let's go ahead and get started. The best way to get started, I think, is let's define what we mean by social emotional learning. Jeannie, you want to kick us off?
Sure, thanks, Andy. So good afternoon, everybody. We know that there are a lot of definitions out there when we speak about SEL. So just for today's purposes and just to level set us all, we're going to use the definition that is on the screen. And I'm not going to read it for you word for word. You certainly are capable of reading, but I'll just summarize. When we talk about SEL, we're talking about those things that impact our learning beyond academics. So the human element of things. We're talking about things like critical thinking, emotional well-being, conflict resolution, abilities to make decisions, work together as a team. And although these things can be really hard to quantify, sometimes we do know that a student's emotional well-being can affect how they learn and the learning environment that they are in. So it's really important that we talk about addressing SEL, and for that, I'm going to turn it over to Adam.
Thank you, Christina, and thank you everyone for being here. So that's a great summary of SEL. It's basically everything in school that we do for our kids that's not the academics, but it directly impacts the academics when you look at it. So it's all those soft skills things that aren't necessarily tested, but I would argue are even more important than a specific standard or what they do on a test. So one of the reasons why SEL is so important for gifted learners, and I will say it's important for every learner, every child, but gifted in particular, is that gifted children have asynchronous brain development. And there's a big long definition there for you from the NAGC. But again, in summary, what we realize now is that the gifted brains are developing differently than their typical age peers. So different parts of the brain, again, depending on the child, every child is a little different. Different parts of the brains are developing at different rates and at different times. One of the things that we've been noticing in the last few years that even the frontal lobe, which is your logic and reasoning, tends to have a delay with many gifted children. So if you think about that, many of the gifted kids, we think of gifted as one way, but really it's, yes, academically they're strong, but they're not well organized, they can't remember things. A lot of that is that frontal lobe delay that we've been noticing in gifted. So it all comes down to the asynchronous development.
And what that means for us as educators when we're looking at results on ability tests and we're looking at students who are gifted, you might have a student who is really strong in, say, a quantitative reasoning, but not as strong in verbal reasoning, or vice versa. In fact, a lot of times in gifted kids, we see that our most advanced learners have extreme profiles like these, where one type of reasoning is really exceptionally stronger than another. And when we look at this and understand how our students learn and the areas of cognitive strength, then we as educators can adjust lessons accordingly and make sure that we're teaching them aligned to how they learn best, right? So we want to make sure that we're highlighting those strengths and we're maximizing their opportunities for growth.
All right, so because of this asynchronous development and everything going on with gifted learners and their brains, we can say clearly that most gifted kids are highly sensitive. So I give talks all over the place. I've been gifted for a long time, and I get, well, what is a gifted learner? Well, it's really hard to package it all into one box because we are talking about individuals. But what I can say over, the past 20 years working with gifted kids and their families is that gifted kids are more sensitive. Whether they're expressing it or not, they tend to be observing, seeing things, and reacting to things. And I think a lot of this is based on their asynchronous development, but they do tend to be more sensitive. And that directly relates to trauma. There's been a lot of talk about trauma with the recent pandemic and our focus on supporting all kids through these times and their social and emotional development. But gifted kids, because they tend to be more sensitive, I argue tend to be more impacted by trauma because they are absorbing what's going on around them. They are taking it in, they are thinking about things and making connections far beyond their typical age peers. And these things will impact them more because they are more sensitive to it. So there are lots of kinds of trauma. There are four kind of most known, we'll kind of summarize here because, again, these are the big ones out there that our kids tend to be going through. You have single event trauma, and that's a trauma that happens one time. Typically, it's not that hard to overcome when you're looking in the spectrum of traumas. Think of it as like a car accident. It happened one time. Most of us, you may be hesitant getting back into the car right away, but we move on and we're able to get through it. It's not reoccurring. The more impactful one is developmental trauma. And developmental trauma is a trauma that goes on over a period of time. It is not easy to overcome, and it physically changes the brain and how it functions. So these are kinds of traumas like abuse, physical, mental abuse. It could be high poverty. It could be discrimination. It could be any number of things that is being inflicted on a child. In this case, we're talking about children, that starts impacting them. And what's really interesting, and we really don't have an answer to it yet, is we don't know how a child is going to react to this kind of trauma. We're doing studies where siblings can go through the same trauma, same kind of pattern of abuse or whatever it may be, and they react totally differently. You can have one who kind of gets over it, as we say, and moves on and is okay. And then the other sibling just needs to go to therapy and has a really hard time coming to grips with what happened to them and moving on. And these are siblings in the same household who've gone through it. So there's a lot of research going on, but what I can say, it is, you can tell in the brain, it affects different parts of the brain and how it reacts to things. Secondary trauma is something that educators, I would argue, need to be very much aware of, because this is a trauma that isn't done to you, but it is inflicted on someone close to you, or you witness it, and then you start taking on that kind of ownership of it. So there are different fields that this impacts harder. Firefighters, nurses, first responders tend to have a lot of issues with the secondary trauma of witnessing these things happen to others and trying to help them. The highest impacted are educators. So we all go into education wanting to help, wanting to support children. And when we see these things happening to them, it's really hard to disconnect at the end of the day and go home. And also gifted children, being as sensitive as they are, they can see something bad happen and it can totally impact their day. I could go through lots of stories about students I had who witnessed things and seen things, and it just took them off that day, and they were not ready to learn because they had to process just what they saw. And then lastly is gifted neglect trauma. And this is one that I've kind of coined the phrase to. And it's kind of what brought me into gifted education in the first place. And this is what I would argue a trauma that happens to our gifted population when they are not identified and then receive services to meet their needs. So quick story would be when I was teaching middle school, and the students would move up into my 7th and 8th grade classes, and some came out of the gifted program and most did not. And again, this was 7th and 8th grade, so the kids all mixed. And it was really interesting to see that many of particularly boys who were kind of checked out of school, they didn't do their homework, they were awful for the subs, they were behavior problems, but they did well in my class because we did lots of hands-on simulations and interesting activities and things. And they got my humor, they got my sarcasm. I kind of have that dark English sense of humor. And these boys in particular who were basically checked out, I could tell they were super smart. And I'm like, what's going on? And I didn't have the answer to that, so that just kind of settled in the back of my head. Later on, our district started offering free gifted courses. So I'm like, free courses, I'll go and learn. And it clicked in my head that these kids were never identified. So they weren't coming out of the gifted program where they had hours of enrichment and things meant for their intellectual ability. They were left in a classroom where the teachers never identified that they had unique needs. The parents obviously weren't aware of it. And they just went through school day after day, year after year, not being challenged, having the worksheet passed in front of them every day and feeling nothing's for them. They get it already. They learned it a year or two ago. Why bother? So that's where I kind of coined the phrase gift and neglect trauma, which is what's happening to these kids with this huge potential who are sensitive, and we don't meet their needs. And they go through school not having their needs met.
So let's think about as classroom educators and administrators that are on this call, how that really impacts what is happening in your school setting and in your classrooms. I taught in a school where most of my kids were living below the poverty level, and a lot of my students actually had just come out of refugee camps. So that developmental trauma was something that they were coming into my building with. So I was fortunate enough that I had the training to address those needs because we had a lot of issues that popped up now and again. But the other thing that happened is we probably were under identifying some of those gifted kids in my school because they had language barriers or socioeconomic barriers that didn't expose them to certain learning environments. Didn't mean that they weren't gifted. It just meant that they weren't being identified. So when you're looking at those two things combined, especially teaching in a school like I did, you really need to make sure that you're looking at multiple measures and really honing in on those local norms when you're identifying your students, because you don't want to miss those kids. And then just think about where we are as educators post-pandemic. Like I said, I was really fortunate that I was able to have the training to deal with some of those developmental traumas because I knew that's what my students were coming in the door with. But a lot of students now are dealing with not only that developmental trauma, but that secondary trauma that Adam talked about, because they're watching what's happening to their family members and they saw the strain that was put on them, especially if their parents are first responders. And a lot of our teachers are not equipped to deal with that. So that's another reason that looking at that social emotional learning, not only for your students, but making sure that your whole school has emotional well-being is really, really important.
Absolutely, and I would jump in and say, and this is something when I was training my teachers for gifted education back in my last job, is the social emotional needs to come first. If the children are not feeling engaged and comfortable and ready to learn, you can jump up and down in front of the class and do whatever you want with your lesson. They're not going to be ready to learn it that day. And
That's
it
right.
the teacher to kind of step back and realize, okay, let me get to know the room, get to know the kids, and start building from there. All right. So within the gifted realm, I mean, there are lots of, I would argue, definitions or understandings of giftedness out there and a lot of misconceptions. The same with trauma. But just because, kind of like what Christina was talking about, just because a child is gifted doesn't mean they don't have other issues, concerns, or discrepancies in their abilities. So when you look at gifted kids, that they're just as likely to suffer from anxieties or mental disorders or ADHD, anything. You name your list of, what a child may walk into your classroom with, and the gifted kids are just as likely to have that, in addition to the giftedness.
And I would even add too, I have a son who falls into the gifted category. And for him, the anxiety was something that he still, as a college student, struggles with, because once you have that label of being gifted, then he put on himself that pressure to perform, even though he was one of those kids who, if it was interesting to him, he would knock it out of the park. And if it was something that he had already taught himself or he didn't feel was relevant to where his path was going in life, he was like, meh. But then when he made the choice to go meh and not really pay attention to it, the anxiety of not achieving up to what people expected of him was something that he really struggled with.
Well, and part of it, the second one too, are students who, what we're calling now twice exceptional. So they do have a documented, maybe a learning disability that may be masking their giftedness, or maybe they have, well, they do have both because they're twice exceptional. So they're gifted in one or more areas. They have a learning disability in another area. Are we aware of both of these areas, and are we servicing both of those areas? So a lot of times the giftedness will be masked by the disability, because as educators, we're really good about finding when something's not clicking and the kiddo just is not learning what they need to according to their peers. We're good about finding them, diagnosing them, and getting them into supports, at least what I've seen. But a lot of times that takes away from the giftedness, and we need to understand that these kids need time to shine in their area that they're good at. So finding those kids who, when I was a district coordinator, kids who were, we were talking about ELL, English language learners, students with disabilities, I would instruct my coordinators to go look for those kids. If a child tests out of the English language proficiency quickly, that's a sign maybe they have a giftedness in that area. If a child, has been evaluated by a psychologist and really struggles in a certain area, that doesn't mean they might not be able to excel in another area. And where can we service them and support them in those areas let's think about it. If we're that twice exceptional learner and we're only being supported and helped and focused on the areas that we really struggle with, probably don't enjoy, and the areas that we do enjoy and do well in get missed or not even addressed, what does that do to a child year after year? Especially one that's going to be very sensitive. So it comes down to the social and emotional and making sure that we're addressing these softer issues. So kind of what this is all leading up to, and we knew this information before the pandemic, okay, which I don't think the pandemic made anything easier on anyone, but we were starting to see the data that gifted kids are struggling. And so again, the slide, we've known by the time kids get into the high school area, gifted kids are more likely to drop out, they're more likely to commit self-harm, and more likely to attempt suicide than their typical age peers. And I'll let that sink in for a second, because we have the data to show that. But what really worries me, how many kids go unidentified? we are not identifying all of our gifted learners. Some schools, some districts are doing a great job. Some states are doing a great job. But overall, as I travel around, we are not overall doing a great job of identifying all of our gifted learners. I think a lot of us are trying, but when we see this data, I know a lot of those kids that are not showing up here were gifted, and this happened to them, maybe because their needs weren't met. They were never on the radar. And, you know, they figured out school was not for them. What else is not for them? So
And
this is,
oh, I'm sorry, Adam.
go ahead. And I was just gonna say, this is kind of what keeps me going and me doing what I do, so people are aware that there is a problem.
When you think about too the pandemic, what that laid on all of our students, but our gifted students, because if you are looking at some of those kids who have other things like ADD, and when you're learning on a computer, an ADD kid is not going to be able to stay there and focus. They're not really absorbing a lot of the lessons that were being taught. I know for my own child, he graduated in 2020, so he was right at the pandemic, got locked in his room during college. It was not a good experience for him at all. And that, like I said, he struggled with anxiety that led to more of it, because not only was he feeling isolated, it was important for him to be social with people, but his gifted needs were not being met on any level. I mean, it was watch a YouTube video that the teacher or the professor pushed out to me, and he said, well, I can just do that on my own. So what is the purpose of all of this, right? And so especially in college, it's been a real struggle for him, because he chose to self-teach himself, which I feel very fortunate for, but the anxiety and the self-doubt and all of that, because he spent a whole year and a half really not even engaging and just going through the motions. So nothing was being addressed for him, and he was sort of doing it all on his own. So it's really important that now we dive deeper into that social emotional learning with all of our students, because they all were affected on some level. But when you have these gifted kids who already had the propensity to anxiety and all of those other things, we really need to make sure we're addressing what they need now, so that it doesn't get to the point where they're doing something to harm themselves.
Absolutely, and at all levels. So I was just at a CTE conference. So it's career and technical education. And they asked me to come be their keynote because of the work I've done at my prior district, really shining a light on what career and technical education can offer our gifted kids. Because if you think about it, I mean, back in the day, career and technical was for those kids who were, you know, they weren't going to go to college, right? It was go learn a career, move on. But where career and technical has really come is really offering good hands-on, real-world processes and activities that the students can actually see. I can apply this in real life. This is something that I could really get into. They fit into different passions and things like that. So gifted and CTE is a natural fit, because gifted want the big picture. They want to have meaning in things. And it doesn't mean that because a gifted kid's going to take career and technical education, so they're not going to go to college, that they're going to learn some real world things that they can apply what they've learned, see how it works, and be in a very different kind of class. So that's just something to think about too, as we're looking at all grade levels. When we get into high school, we need to make sure that we're offering different kinds of courses and classwork and things that will allow our students to find that meaning.
We do have one question that pertains to this particular point in the conversation here, and that is, are we able to share the research that you mentioned regarding the students and the likelihood? Is that something that is readily available?
That is something I could drop something in later if you want, but go to the Google, and again, they're coming out with more and more. When I started bringing up this in my book, it was well before the pandemic.
And those links will be in the email that we'll follow up with, the links to the books in particular. We're going to get to that in just a bit here. Oh, hey, look at that.
So sorry, my phone's going off here. So the book I wrote a few years ago was Gifted Children and How Trauma Impacts Them. And within that, we talked about the impact of trauma. I worked with a couple other authors. One was a psychologist who adopted a boy from a Romanian orphanage. So she had firsthand accounts trying to help her son through trauma. And we worked through it, and we developed 20 different things that kids really in this situation really want their adults to know. Kind of what was interesting when I was broached to write this book, I was kind of talked into it. I'm not going to write a book. What am I going to write about? But one of my co-authors came out and saw me training my teachers. We had a big PD day, and I was pulling in groups of teachers, working on endorsements, as well as working with gifted teachers to continue, their work and continue their learning. And what we found interesting is a lot of what was going into trauma-based, trauma-based education, where we're going to train teachers to be more aware of being trauma sensitive, what these kids are going through. Those kinds of strategies to help children who've been through trauma were very similar to what I was teaching my teachers to support gifted kids with the social and emotional support. So that's kind of where this book came. Is I don't know exactly what the connection is yet. I think it might come down to that kind of asynchronous development and how the brain works, because we know gifted kids' brains are wired differently. We're now starting to realize that kids who've been through trauma, their brains are wired a little differently. But social and emotional is the key, and that's what most of this book is about. So we came up with 20 different things that, as I've experienced over the years and they've experienced, that these kids would like the adults in their lives to know. So we're going to highlight a few of them here. But kind of the big picture is social and emotional needs to be at the forefront. And you need to start as an educator or as a principal looking at classroom environments and making sure that they are environments where the students feel included, where they want to be, where they're going to want to do well and learn. If we don't start with that, we can't be surprised when kids aren't learning.
Well, and I'm just going to add to, before Adam goes through these, as you're looking at these as educators, just think to yourself, like, these are not only things that are going to be great for gifted kids, but we should employ these tactics and these methodologies in our classrooms for all of our learners. Every student should be taught the way that a gifted student is taught, and it really is better for our classroom environment as a whole.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, these strategies are essential for our gifted learners, but kind of the secret in gifted education is good for all learners. Anyone can apply these strategies. When I was going through and getting my gifted endorsement through the state, I would come back and work with my special needs students and apply a lot of different strategies that came out of the gifted world. So absolutely, you need these for gifted, but they're great for all kiddos in your classroom. So again, one of the 20 was talking about differentiation. And I know different school districts I've worked with things, differentiation's kind of got a bad rap. Differentiation does not mean you don't need special services for kids. It does not mean that every single child is doing something different all day long. But what I look at for differentiation is it's getting to know your child and doing what they need according to their needs. And this is going to involve, again, getting to know your students. So you're going to have to be doing some pre-testing. And I think there's been a lot of talk of, yes, we do pre-testing. I don't see a lot of it really going on. I don't know if teachers are afraid that this shows the kid knows everything already. What am I going to do? Well, don't bore them with stuff they already know would be lesson number one. But really getting to know what these kids know. And it doesn't mean that every single little detail you have to give these full-blown tests and quizzes and things to, but you need to start understanding, what do your children already know when they walk in your room? A lot of gifted kids will know a lot before they come in. Many of the others just need a couple repetitions and they've got it. But they still need to learn. So we can't assume just kids are gifted, they know XYZ already, because they're coming from different backgrounds and places and knowledge bases. And then we can't just assume that Just because a kid's in second grade, they're all ready to learn this or these set of standards. So a great example is, a great kindergarten teacher. You walk into a kindergarten classroom where the teacher really knows their stuff. There are groups, she or he's pulling groups back and forth. Kids are fluid. We're doing 10 minutes of this, 20 minutes of this, because a kindergarten teacher is taking in kids, many of which have never been in school before, some of which have gone to a great expensive preschool. So, so they have this huge range of kids walking in. That doesn't really change every year. I mean, doesn't change as you get older, because kids are moving, things have happened over the summer, all kinds of things. And gifted kids are going to come in with just as different background and needs as anyone else. They might come in with some true deficits, depending on what they've gone through. So you need some true differentiation. It doesn't have to be all day, every day, but as you get more comfortable getting to know your kids and their individual needs, doing it and offering it more and more. So that would be taking pieces of the curriculum, breaking it down, pre-assessments. A lot of it could be based on need. If you've got a kid, or not need, but interests. If you've got some gifted learners who are really interested in a certain topic, using that to get them to learn about other things. I had one year, I don't know why it was not because the movie came out, because that's back in when I was younger, but the Titanic. I don't know what was going on that year, but I had 3 or 4 kids that everything was the Titanic. So I didn't fight it. It annoyed me. Yes, I love history, but I'm not a huge Titanic buff. But everything we tried to do for a long time was weave in the Titanic to hook them into that learning. That's kind of differentiating, yes. We're studying the Civil War, so I'm like, okay, Titanic, Civil War. The first battleships made of metal were in the Civil War. So I'm like, oh, here, let's research this. And they got to do a little project engaging them that way because they found those connections. So again, it's getting to know the kids, getting them to do different things based on their needs or their interests. And again, understanding that, just because a kid's labeled gifted, that doesn't mean they know everything. It doesn't mean they're ready to learn that day. They could have a vast background. They could have a very weak background, depending on where they come from. And a lot of this is allowing the students to have some input. As the students begin to see that you're doing things differently for different kids, they will appreciate that. The kids know they're all coming from different backgrounds, that they're all different. This isn't a factory. Everyone is not at the same learning level. Everyone is not at the same place to learn. The kids know that, even the little ones. So I know I've coached a lot of teachers through like, oh, we can't do things different. Yes, the kids know they're all different. You just need to have that conversation. Well, you need to know this, so we're going to help you with this. You need to know that, so I'm going to help you with that. And it's setting up that culture and climate of, yes, I'm getting to know my students, regardless of labels and what's happened, and everyone's going to get to learn every day. So that's kind of my summary of real differentiation for these kids.
Well, and that leads into one of the questions in the chat here that perhaps we can address. It says, is there a social emotional learning curriculum that has been field tested and deemed efficacious with gifted populations specifically?
I would say there's a lot out there and there's not a lot out there. The SEL is kind of the gray area. When you look at schools, I mean, the last 20 years, it was all about data and gathering data and test scores and things. Well, what's easy to test and research and do? Those hard academic skills. That's easy. That's tangible. All of these kinds of things, a lot of it comes down to the teacher, their personality, their structure, what they're comfortable with, and how they run their classroom. A lot of it's down to the mix of kids who are in that classroom. So even me as a teacher, I changed and adapted, sometimes class period to class period, based on the mix of kids and what we needed to do. And I noticed myself being very different as a teacher in different rooms. It's really hard. And teachers, we all kind of have our own teaching style. And that kind of muddies the water if we're going to really start looking at, specific data and how these things can work. There is a lot out there for social and emotional. And what I tell teachers and principals is look at all of them and take bits and pieces and add them to your toolbox, just like you would any kind of strategy. If you're going to teach adding fractions or different things, you're going to show lots of strategies and have lots of different ways to try to teach it to the kids. Because if they don't get it one way, you're ready to teach it another way, and we kind of build our toolboxes. It's the same kind of thing with social and emotional. So there's stuff out there. I wouldn't directly recommend one thing over anything else per se. It kind of comes down to your school and classroom climate and what you as a teacher can kind of take pieces of and apply and see what works. And it may work. These certain strategies may work for you one year. Next year you try them and it just doesn't work. You got to try something new just based on this mix of kids. You need to be open to that. All right, a couple others. So please stop asking me from questioning things. So as we're looking at gifted, kind of sometimes the stereotypical gifted kid is that kid in the classroom with a hand up all the time. Nerd, teacher, what's this? This is constantly engaged. That's great, though it can be quite annoying when you have 25 of them and you're trying to get through a lesson and things like that. But something that I've noticed, and again, it's me kind of thinking like, why does this happen? What's occurring? You see, as you walk around schools, the younger kids, kindergarten, first grade, are so excited. Like they're skipping and jumping and back, and you go into classrooms and they're learning. Something seems to happen as they get older. You don't see that kind of love of learning. And there was one school I was at, and this just burned in my brain. I think it was first or second grade. They were little. And they're just the sad little line going across. And I'm like, where are you guys going? We're going to art. I'm like, shouldn't we be excited to go to art? We're second graders, first graders. We're not excited to go to art. Not to mean they should be running amok and climbing on the trees and whatever on the way. I mean, my kids walked in a line, don't get me wrong, but it just is what's happening. And I think a lot of this kind of falls into where we're seeing, like, especially the gifted kids, as they get into high school, they're realizing this isn't for me. The gifted brain, these kids are able to make those connections, and they're able to move so much faster through things that curriculum that interest them. And I think a lot of the times we're kind of stopping them. We got to go through these standards today. This is not in my lesson plan today. Well, we're here for the kids, aren't we? So when you have those kids that are like, insatiably wanting to learn, that's good. Let's just try to corral them. Like I told you about the Titanic kids. Titanic was not in the standards, but let me tell you, we did a lot of it because that got them learning, that got them interested. That's this whole social and emotional, finding those things that they're interested in. And in gifted kids, another thing I would say is like, well, how would you define a gifted kid? Well, one, yes, they all have sensitivities, but two, when they're young, they have an insatiable appetite to learn. They're like sponges. They acquire, math concepts and all the interesting facts and languages and different things so much faster and at a higher rate than their peers. It's fun to watch and learn. But as they get older, we tend to not see that as much. They're being forced into these boxes, and it's really quite sad. And I think that's part of, if they're not inquisitive anymore and they're not wanting to learn, what's the point? So when we're looking at this, we need to be encouraging them to ask questions. That doesn't mean they have free for all and are interrupting you every 2 minutes. They can jot down their questions on a pad, and come back to them later. That's something that I used to do with my kids. We always had those spiral notebooks. I was the king of spiral notebooks. You had to have 12 different colors, and different colors were for different things. And one was just their like brain dumping journal. And the kids could write down, all right, this is your third question in 10 minutes. I need you to start jotting them down. I'll come back to you at the end of the lesson. and answer any questions you have, but we got to move on. But you're honoring those questions and things. And I think a lot of that is the kids, as they go through our system, and again, not every system is like that, but I've seen a lot of it, they just kind of lose this love of learning. And I think a lot of it is because we're not allowing them to question and have a lot of say in what they want to learn. So tying that in again, some of these other things is making sure that what they're learning has relevance and meaning. It's okay to have a frank conversation with your kids and say, we need to learn this because this is a standard that the state says every fifth grader needs to know. But what part of this interests you? Let's take it on a different direction and start getting their input in it. Or none of us are really interested in this. We're only going to spend a day or two on it, and then we'll move on to this piece that really you guys want to spend more time on. So it's having those conversations, it's being honest with them, and kind of showing them how these pieces fit together and telling them the why. So gifted kids naturally, they make those connections faster. I always think of it as their brain like a superhighway. Things are going back and forth. They're able to pull up and retrieve stuff from 6 months ago that you forgot you said, and they're able to pull these pieces together and make these connections and start making a big picture. If they're not seeing that, they have a hard time finding the relevance in what they're doing. So these packets and things that just pass across their desk, they start losing meaning. So again, the questioning, that I've seen a lot of the inquiry-based learning, which is good. Gifted kids love that inquiry, like, why does this happen? Let's go through things to figure it out. Applying that beyond science is a great way to engage the kids. The problem project-based learning, those kinds of things where the kids can develop questions and research them, and you tie in your standards as you go, but the kids are kind of taking the lead on what they want to know about. And as a teacher, it's more fun, honestly. You get to see, I mean, a lot of times they come up with things that are like, I had no idea, or I had a fifth grader teaching me about the solar system. That kid did a research project because he wanted to learn about the solar system. He knew more than I'll ever know about the solar system. But he put way more into that project than if I would have just assigned him this task to do. So.
Yeah, I was just gonna say what you just said, Adam, that as a teacher, it's first of all, you have to let go of a few things. It's gonna be more chaotic and more messy in your classroom, right? If you say this is what we're working on, but you can do that in any way you want. Like you said, you had kids who wanted to apply it to the Titanic. My son would have applied it to Jacques Cousteau because he loved the ocean. Anytime he got to talk about the ocean, he would go 1000%. And you know, really, when we allow kids to do that project-based learning and that problem solving, we are doing their future employers a favor as well. And this is one of those things that fall under, this is good for all kids. We're preparing these kids for jobs that don't exist, right? We're switching from preparing kids to go into an industrial nation into a world where they're going to have jobs that don't even exist right now. So how are they going to survive in that world if they're not questioning, if they're not knowledge seekers, if they're not problem solvers? They're not going to thrive in that world. So we need to step back, let our classrooms be a little bit more chaotic, allow for a little more free discussion. And again, this is good for all kids. And it is hard because I work in a state where if your kids don't score a certain amount on the standardized tests at the end of the year, the state tests, you don't get as much money at your school. So there's a tremendous amount of pressure to get through that scope and sequence and make sure that you're like, well, we already talked about that and I've only planned a week for this lesson. But really, when you let your kids explore and solve problems and ask questions, they're going to be retaining that information much better because it's going to be something that's interesting to them. And like you said, they're seeing more of a big picture, and ultimately they're going to do better on those tests in the end, and they're going to do better once they leave our schools and get out into the working world.
Totally agree. And one of the things you kind of triggered for me is what I tell teachers is a great gifted teacher is more of a coach. And I don't say that because I'm into sports. I'm one of the least sporty people you'll come across. But if you think about a coach is leading the athletes to be their best. and leading them through strategies and helping them learn more about themselves and helping them practice and do better. That's what a great gifted teacher does. We're not here to disseminate knowledge. We have Google now. You can go Google it. But can I help you understand good resources? Can I help you find exactly what you're trying to question, look for, and then apply it? So especially now with the information age, and like you said, Christina, with us trying to prepare kids for stuff we don't even know is going to be there, they need to be able to think, problem solve, and go through and experience things. And we need to help them with those skills. And that's all soft skills stuff. All right, I think we had one more. So another thing we talked about in the book was making the connections. So I said connections, connections, connections. I cannot emphasize how important making the connections with the students in your classroom is. And this doesn't mean that you need to spend the first month of the year doing kumbaya and craft projects and icebreaker stuff that drives me nuts. But you do need to spend some time getting to know your kids. They need to get to know you a little bit. And you need to invest that time at the beginning of the school year to really do that and set the stage for this is an inclusive environment. We're honoring everybody's skills and abilities. As a teacher, I'm going to get to know you and help you learn. I kind of talked about it earlier. We're not all going to be doing the same thing at the same time because we're all different. But there are lots of different learning activities you can do to kind of get to know your kids without doing the fluff stuff and really get into learning. One of the easiest things is writing. A couple of my other books, it's all like writing prompts and things that I would use in my classroom to kind of, I call it trick the kids into writing more, because lots of gifted kids are not that, enthused with writing and the writing process. And that could be another whole webinar. But writing prompts are amazing to try to get to know your kids. And they don't have to be these long drawn out processes, but just tricking your kids into writing something that they find funny or meaningful and skimming through. And that's just an easy way for a teacher to really get to know their kids if you're incorporating the writing. Another one is those classroom discussions. Once you have that kind of rapport of trust with your kids, having discussions and free sharing knowledge and ideas and questioning each other and backing up your statements and going back and forth, very useful skills, not tested, but you can learn a lot, teach a lot of skills at the same time, throw in some standards that you have to check off. But there are a lot of activities where you can make connections, still teach them valuable skills, and not spend a lot of time on fluff. I used to think of myself more as like that traditional teacher where I'm not spending a week and blah, blah, blah. We've got learning to do. But you can do it in a way where, you're getting to know your kids and it's meaningful what they're doing. As a kid, as a learner myself, if I liked the teacher, I did well.
Yeah.
If I didn't, it was not fun. You could ask my mother. There were a couple grade level, you go from principal's list to failing. And it's just, I was not engaged. I didn't feel comfortable, whatever it was. One of them was 5th grade, and that ended up being my favorite year to teach. Go figure. But a lot of it is these connections and things. And for a lot of teachers, I think we get caught up in the teachery stuff where, I've got to get the grade book done. I've got to grade that pile of papers. I have to get through my email, all these extra things. There's the PD after school that distracts us from that really critical 6 hours of the day where we're with these kids and we are the role model, whether we think of ourselves or not, where we can help them learn, help show them, I make mistakes as well. I didn't know that. I'm okay with that. We're going to learn from it, and kind of setting that whole example of, being a person in this culture and how we should behave and problem solve and do things. We miss a lot of that, and that's one of the strongest things that we do every day, whether we know it or not.
Well, that's the end of the slides. We do have a couple of great questions in the chat here. I want to read here. Let's start with this one. My state only allows 5% identification. Any ideas on how to get around that?
That's actually a new one, but we need labels in gifted, but I hate labels because the labels are what usually comes with your funding. You could, I mean, what we do to kids by calling them gifted, when, you know, even gifted gurus would debate what giftedness is, let alone their parents may or may not have a clue what giftedness is. I would say be more inclusive. When I was the manager of a very large school district out here in Arizona, and if the kid would benefit from being in this program, you put them in the program. I don't care. So if that means, you know, you only get counted for 15 kids, but really you've got 17 in there because you know these other two, they just need to be in there, then we do what we need to do. As you know, as educators, we're here for kids. So, I mean, one would be you need to start advocating for where does this arbitrary 5% comes from, because the definition of gifted ranges anywhere from 2 to 10%. Where they came up with 5, I don't know. But within the system and what you can do yourself, I would try to get creative and work around it. I mean, train more teachers to work with gifted, and we don't need to label it gifted to have more engaging classrooms where teachers really understand that social emotional piece and will really support the kids in the way they would support a gifted learner. You know, Christina was right earlier when she said it's gifted is good for everybody. These strategies can be applied. I apply them to my special needs students. I had special needs students doing Socratic discussions with junior grade books, and their special ed teachers were shocked. And I'm like, they can do it. We can't hide this great stuff from them. Did I do the exact same thing? No, but what they were able to do was amazing. So I would argue get creative. I was always the outside of the box person. So if you need to do non-gifted, gifted stuff, by all means do it and include more kids. You never know what kids will rise once we allow these kinds of things to take place and happen when you have that environment.
All right, next one, we have a final question in the chat here. It says, should all of our students generally be placed in honors classes?
Ooh, depends on what you say honors class. I would say AP courses are good for some gifted learners, not good for others. I would say AP courses are good for some learners and not for others in general. So it depends. If your honors or accelerated class is set up like an AP class, you need to understand some gifted kids will thrive in that environment. Some will be totally turned off by it. When I was pushing to offer more gifted programs in our high schools in my district, which was one of my big initiatives, I had, you know, I went out to, I'll be honest, the principals were not totally open to it, most of them. So I just went to the parents and the kids and the community themselves and started asking questions and having events. And this is my hunch, what's going on here? And most of my high school started offering true gifted courses. And what that meant was some kids went into AP, some just went into an honors gifted version of, where everything didn't hang on a test and where there weren't 2 hours of homework every night, but the rigor and the level of material they were going through was pretty high. They just had a more gifted version of, because their learning style. They wanted more choices. They wanted more project-based learning. They liked the rigor, but the test, they weren't going to spend hours studying for a test. So yes and no, depends on how you're structuring those classes. One of my high schools ended up offering several levels of biology. So we had an AP biology gifted and AP biology. We had biology gifted, regular biology, because of all the interest in the kids. So some of the kids wanted that AP rigor, and we're good. We're not taking that away. Some just wanted it differently as far as project-based, those kinds of things. And we were able to work with the teachers to offer all of those in the schedule. So there's something weird where like 6th grade ends and like all of the gifted and high achieving kids just get dumped together. That's not the best way to set it up, but if that's all you have, it's better than nothing. So gifted, I don't know, I guess it comes down to gifted isn't just more, gifted isn't just harder, gifted is different.
Well, there you go. And we are just about at time here, so we've got a few things that that we're promoting. I'm going to try and take them in chronological order here. This weekend is NAGC. We, the three of us, will be there. Stop by and see us at the exhibit hall. And we've got presentations. Check your program. After that, January, we've got Arizona Gifted. For any Arizona folks, you both will be there presenting. Is that accurate?
Correct.
That's
Yeah.
the 11th and 12th of January. And then we've got the conference in July in, I think, Pennsylvania. Oh, there it is, Villanova. July 21st through the 23rd. Adam, you want to do the quick sales pitch on that?
Absolutely. So I'm President-elect of SANG, and SANG is supporting the emotional needs of the gifted, and that's children through adults. It's been around since 1982 and started when the founder had one of his clients, a teenage gifted boy, commit suicide, and started this whole group. We're now international. We have different affiliates out in Europe as well as across the country in Canada. Our big conference, which I'm helping coordinate, is coming up. We're in Villanova, July 21st to 23rd. Our keynotes are Scott Barry Kaufman and Richard Cash, but it's a family event. We'll have activities for kids, young adults. Sing is a very much family oriented. It's going to be smaller conference, but if you're interested in learning more about the social emotional piece, that's definitely a good place to go because we have clinicians, therapists, educators from all over the world actually will be presenting and sharing.
That's fantastic. All right, double check here. Wait, hang on. One final question. What do you suggest for those kids that don't do well with PBL?
As in project-based learning, they don't have to do it all the time. So sometimes, again, when you're looking at project-based learning, it's a tool you can use. It can be used in groups. It can be used independently. Sometimes they call them, what am I thinking of? Choice projects or those kinds of things where kids can learn independently. Genius Hour has been used a lot. But if some kids need more structure, that doesn't mean they have to go back to worksheets. They can do more projects where you have rubrics and they're going through and meeting the needs that you set out before them. If they need it to be more open-ended, it's more of a problem-based learning where they're trying to solve a problem. Within my classroom, I integrated both quite a bit. So sometimes gifted learners really need a structure. So I would have much structured rubrics and they would go through a project. Other times it was much more open-ended just based on what the kids needed.
Well, there you have it. Thank you to our panelists for the conversation, and thanks to all of you for attending. As mentioned earlier, keep an eye on your email. We're going to have a follow-up that's going to have a link to the recording, certificate, links to all these great things that you see on your screen here. Check out Adam's website, brightchildaz.com, and the SANG Gifted, 1G, right? 1G in that URL? All right, perfect. Just making sure. Oh, right, because gifted, SE, all right, that makes sense. All right, so sanggifted.org. Thank you so much. And stop by and see us in Indianapolis if you're going to be there this weekend, and have a great rest of your afternoon. Thank you.